judge was forgetting that we have yet to see a single citizen in Kansas who is unable to comply with our laws. He was assuming incorrectly that these citizens are somehow prevented from voting. They all can vote if they simply provide their proof of citizenship.
Kansas Secretary of State Kris Kobach responding to a court's decision in that state to refuse an appeal not to count votes from people who could not present proof of citizenship when they registered to vote. By court order, Kansas must now count votes from people who did not provide proof of citizenship, even in local and state elections. And sadly, this is a trend occurring all over the country, putting into question the integrity of several state and federal elections being held this year, including, obviously, the presidential election this November. A note now that it's a good time to call in to get in our conversation a bit later in our program. You can do so by calling me at 1-877-NEWSMAX. That's 1-877-639-7629. Joining us with more via FaceTime, that aforementioned Secretary of State from the state of Kansas, my friend Kris Kobach. Kris, it's great to have you here tonight on Newsmax Prime. Thanks very much for your time.
My pleasure, JD. Great to be with you.
So what is next for Kansas and your state and your office in terms of the elections following the court decision?
Well, let me back it up and put it in context. So we've got 4 states right now, including your home state, JD, Arizona. There are 4 states that require proof of citizenship to register to vote. Those are Kansas, Arizona, Alabama, and Georgia. And we are having to fight tooth and nail against the Obama administration and against the ACLU to enforce our laws. And Kansas right now, we're battling 4 lawsuits simultaneously. And the one you mentioned was one of our 2 state court lawsuits against the ACLU. And it's absolutely mind-blowing how the judges are either ignoring what the law says or twisting what the law says to reach these conclusions and their conclusions don't allow us to enforce our law. So, for example, there's another case in federal court where a judge came to the absolutely bizarre conclusion that Congress, when it passed the motor voter law, intended to create a special track that if you register at the DMV, you don't have to prove your citizenship in that state. But if you register by mail in that state, you do have to prove your citizenship. Makes no sense to read the law that way, but the ACLU, they're specialists at twisting words and taking them out of context to try to get activist judges to misinterpret the law.
And of course, you're being diplomatic, talking about, quote, activist judges. I just wonder, Kris, have the courts gone completely partisan? It seems to me you've got a breakdown with a bunch of leftists now on the bench, and then sadly from Republican appointees, guys who are open borders who think somehow non-citizens should exercise the franchise in this country. Am I being too brutal with that assessment?
Oh, maybe just one click too brutal. I mean, these judges will say, Secretary Kobach, you haven't proven that enough non-citizens are voting. Well, we showed them in one of these cases 25 aliens who either got on our voter rolls or attempted to get on our voter rolls after our proof of citizenship law went into effect in just one county. Well, we have 105 counties in Kansas. And, you multiply that out proportionally to the state, we're talking about hundreds of aliens on our voter rolls. We have close elections. In fact, we just had one this past Tuesday where it was a dead tie. And if you've got a handful or even one alien voting in that election, that can throw the election, or at a minimum, it cancels out the vote of U.S. citizens. And some of these judges just don't seem to care, or we can show them case after case, all kinds of examples, and they say, well, that's not enough. That's not enough. You've got to show us that aliens are taking over the elections in some catastrophic way before we'll even recognize that there's a problem.
And this trend continues in the federal courts. Voter ID in Texas and my native state, North Carolina, the mainstream media shaping the striking down of those voter ID laws as, they're repeating the meme of the left that it's, quote, a solution looking for a problem rather than a problem in need of solution. For example, take a listen to MSNBC reporter Zachary Roth.
The tide is really beginning to turn on this, and the reason for that is we're getting more facts on the ground that show that these voter ID laws, as we know, don't stop any fraud because fraud essentially doesn't exist.
Fraud doesn't exist? Kris, your take on that statement?
It's unbelievable. I mean, but that's what the left says over and over again. They keep reciting it. Fraud doesn't exist. Look, in Kansas, in addition to those 25 aliens that I mentioned out of just one county, we showed over 200 cases when we went to the legislature and got our law in place in 2011. Over 200 cases of various forms of voter fraud, not just aliens voting, but people impersonating other voters, vote by mail fraud, you name it. And the funny thing is the left never recognizes when we present actual factual cases. And in Kansas, I can give you more examples. Just last year, my office got the authority to prosecute voter fraud. I'm the only Secretary of State in the country that has that right now. We have already got 4 convictions. We've got a 5th one coming pretty soon, we expect. And we've got a few more cases in the hopper of people double voting twice in the same election. We've got so many different forms of voter fraud, and this is Kansas. There are lots of states where the problem is a lot worse, JD, and you know, places like California, places like Illinois, places where voter fraud is truly endemic. I think it's sort of typical in Kansas. We might have a little more alien voting than most states because we have so many aliens coming to the United States illegally and legally to work in our meatpacking plants. But the bottom line is voter fraud exists everywhere. In Kansas, Arizona, and a few other states, we're doing something about it. But the Obama administration and the ACLU, they are hitting us hard, and we are litigating for dear life.
You know what's interesting, Kris, and I'd like to get your take on something that appeared on the pages of the Washington Post, an article hiding a guy they refer to as a Democrat, quote, super lawyer, Mark Elias. He's the guy who's really the point person out there fighting against voter ID laws. There's the article and the headline, "The Crusade of a Democratic Super Lawyer with Multi-Million-Dollar Backing." Now that multi-million-dollar backing comes from George Soros. That Washington Post article says Soros thus far has donated $5 million to fund this litigation. Now, you and I have been around politics a while. Do you think Soros has kept it to like $5 million, or is he the point person for a whole lot of dough being pumped in to this legal fight to prevent ballot security and people being who they claim to be when they sign up to vote?
Well, you know, I have no idea what the total number is that Soros has pumped into this. And as you know, it goes through multiple sources, multiple foundations, and you never know ultimately where it's all coming from. But let me illustrate it for you this way, JD. So typically, let's take an example of a case I argued out in the District of Columbia. This one was against the Obama administration. We walk into the courtroom. Representing the state of Kansas is me and one other lawyer. On the other side, you've got 4 lawyers for the Department of Justice and about 8 or 10 lawyers from the ACLU and their fellow travelers. So you've got about 12 or more lawyers on the other side versus 2. It's always that way. Whenever we are fighting to defend our laws, the ACLU and their affiliated foundations are so well funded. They've got lawyer after lawyer. They can't even fit them all at the table. Meanwhile, we are doing it with a bare bones financing on the state side. And they've got a ton of money financing their litigation. And I don't know where it all comes from, but there's a lot of it.
Got a couple of minutes left, Kris, and I'd like to get your take on this. Donald Trump, of all people, gave voice to this problem in a recent interview with Fox News, and he brings up an interesting point that seems pretty straightforward. Without adequate voter ID laws, we lose control of the election process. Let's listen and get your reaction.
The whole thing with voter ID, identification, I think is really, people are going to walk in, they're going to vote 10 times maybe. Who knows? They're going to vote 10 times. So I am very concerned, and I hope the Republicans are going to be very watchful.
Yeah, they got to be vigilant.
I hope the authorities are going to be very watchful.
And quite apart from a Republican-Democrat thing, Kris, are you expecting to have more ballot observers, to have people in watching? Or would that be wise in every state in the union, given what appears to be going on right now? We've got about a minute left.
Yeah, it is wise for especially people who fear voter fraud, like mostly folks who are more conservative. The other side never seems to be worried about it, perhaps because they know it's existing. Yeah, having observers to come in and pick it up, especially in states that are not like Kansas and don't have the protections in place. Sometimes you can deter voter fraud that way. But the bottom line is, this is going to be, it could be a tight election. It might be tight in some states. And when you have a handful of votes, that may be enough to steal the election. And the other side just keeps saying, oh, there's not enough voter fraud to justify it. But that doesn't make any sense. We only see the tip of the iceberg. Most voter fraud goes undetected. And what Donald Trump just said about people voting multiple times, as I mentioned earlier, I have personally prosecuted multiple cases of people voting multiple times just in the last year. So this is a big problem. We have to address it, and we have to keep pushing ahead. There are about a dozen states that have, serious, strict photo ID, and then there are another 4 states that have proof of citizenship. But we're still a very tiny portion of the country. We need the majority of the country protecting elections, not just a few red states.
A cautionary note sounded by the Secretary of State from the state of Kansas, Kris Kobach. Kris, my old pal, I appreciate your time. Thanks for laying out what's going on in your state and offering that warning to the other 49 states. Now, when we come back, Diamond and Silk actually disagree with Donald Trump? They do on one thing. I'll tell you about that next.